Oscar Wilde, Sean Casey, George Bernard Shaw. In a way, that doesn't really matter that he hadn't read them. The point is, he's trying to just get people, young British record players, to say, why is Kevin Rowland singing all these names? And to start a conversation about what that meant. So it's a very interesting thing. If the message wasn't clear in the song, Rowland made the song's message clear in interviews, so he would give lengthy interviews in the British music press saying, for example, in Sounds, which I've already mentioned, he said, I wrote this song because Irish jokes made me sick. A lot of people believe all that stuff, he said. I'm sure the BBC or Lou Grade could stop it, but they won't. Anyway, that's what the list of great Irish authors are in it for, to show the other side. And that line there's really important for Kevin, because what he wants to do in Dexys is to show the other side. And the term that he keeps using, or used in his interview with me, is that he wanted to correct the misunderstanding. He felt there was a misunderstanding in Britain about the Irish, and he felt the need, he felt compelled to correct that misunderstanding by showing that there were other aspects to Irishness, other than the kind of caricatures that circulated. So what's interesting about Kevin at this particular moment in his career is he's not saying that he's either Irish or English. He's actually acting as an intermediary between the two cultures. He feels a desire to act as an intermediary, to negotiate between the two different cultures. Just checking for time here, how we're doing. We're doing okay. From a specifically second generation Irish perspective then, I think Dance Dance, what it did is it upturned the ideas of Irishness that were prevalent in British culture. It offered an alternative idea of what it meant to be Irish, based on esteemed qualities such as literariness, creativity and erudition. And in an environment, the late 70s, that offered very little positive reinforcement of Irish ethnicity for the second generation. What Dance Dance offered, as Cotto Ridden of The Pogues said to me, she said, it offered so much about finding out who you are as a second generation Irish youth. It was part of the process of rediscovering who you were. And we can maybe elaborate on that in questions. But the point I'd like to make as I've come to the end of this section on Dexys is this. Although Rowland became, if you like, an icon for the second generation Irish, he actually wasn't setting out to do that. He said to me what he was more interested in doing was trying to show some of this Irish culture, as he puts it, to the British, to, in his words, to correct the misunderstanding. He was really gratified then when he saw his British fan base singing this list of Irish authors that he put into the chorus of Dance Dance. He said this, I remember walking through a university bar in 1980 and people didn't really know who we were. And a female English student was walking through the bar and she was singing the chorus of Dance Dance. I remember just getting a real buzz out of that, he says, the fact that she was singing the names of Irish writers. So he's putting the names of Irish writers into the mouths of a British or an English audience and making them aware of the fact that there were more dimensions to Irishness than the British press at the time perhaps allowed for. Now, if Rowland was a kind of intermediary at this time between Irishness and Englishness, other second generation Irish figures approached this issue differently. Shane MacGowan, for example, would tackle Irish-English issues in a rather different way to Dexys and to Kevin Rowland. I would say specifically MacGowan's band The Pogues seemed to express the actual experience of being both Irish and English at the same time, presenting themselves as London Irish and drawing on Irish folk and English punk in equal measures. It's an interesting synthesis musically to fuse a certain version of Irish folk music with English punk, and somehow it worked and it was popular. So I'll now turn to my account of Shane MacGowan and The Pogues in this context. A couple of quotes to begin with. One is from the London Irish playwright Martin McDonagh, who many people will have heard of. And McDonagh said this, the Pogues were the first people who helped define what you could be as a second generation Irish person in this country. But the quote I really want to focus on is the second quote, which is from Robert Elms, which appeared in The Face magazine in 1985. In his review of the album, Robert Elms said that the Pogues' first album, Red Roses for Me, wasn't an Irish album, but it was a London Irish album. first ever. So, what I want to stress at the outset is that MacGowan and his band at this time were keen to stress that they weren't Irish. In fact, if you read the early Pogues interviews in NME and Melody Maker, they say, we're not an Irish band, we're a London Irish band. And they draw on the sounds of Irish London. One of the things that's interesting is that when the Pogues go to Ireland for the first time in 1975, there's a great deal of controversy towards them. And the concertina player Noel Hill is extraordinarily rude about the Pogues on an RTE radio interview in which he describes their work as a terrible abortion of Irish music, which is an incredibly offensive remark and showed a real lack of awareness of what it meant to be London Irish. So what I'm going to try and do in this section of the paper is talk about how this London Irish thing was evoked in the work of the Pogues. Let's have a look at them. This is the very first Pogues photo shoot taken in the King's Cross area of London in August 1983, which appeared in the New Musical Express that month. Okay, so traditional forms of migrant song, particularly among the Irish, have often been marked by a kind of obsession with the lost ancestral home. What the Irish historian Roy Foster calls the perspective over one's shoulder. We're looking back to where we've come from, and we're mourning it, and we're fixated on it. So studies of Irish migrant song have noted as tendency in such songs for bitter anguish, profound melancholy, and homesick remorse, which sounds a bit like a description of the Smiths, who I'll talk about in a moment. Such themes seem to enact a kind of rejection of the host culture, and they've often been associated with the Irish in London, whose imagination, says Fintan O'Toole, is imbued with the melancholy allure of a lost paradise. So you think of songs like The Mountains of Mourne or Galway Bay, in which we're in the centre of London, which isn't good, and we're singing about somewhere which is great. And there's this kind of thing about idealising where we're from and negativising, if that's the right word, where we're at. Fair enough. But when viewed in the light of this context, MacGowan's early songs for the Pogues are actually doing something very, very different altogether, because they convey less a sentimental image of an absent home than a vivid and vibrant evocation of life in urban London. There's a great deal of excitement in the Pogues about what it means to be in London, and an energy and a vibrancy. And I would argue that the Pogues' songs are as much about England's present as they are about Ireland's past. Indeed, the late Pogues guitarist Philip Chevron referred to what he calls MacGowan's, and I'm not sure Shane would agree with this, but Philip Chevron referred to MacGowan's, quote, love for the oppressor, England, which he claims is expressed in so many of Shane's songs. But so certainly what Chevron is saying is there's a kind of, as well as the afflictions of the outsider, which you hear in the Pogues songs, there's also an affection for England, which Shane isn't particularly comfortable in expressing in interviews, at least to me. Now, whether or not this is the case, it's clear that urban England, as much as rural Ireland, shaped the Pogues' imagination. I'm going to play an extract from the first song on the Pogues' first album. It's a song called Transmetropolitan. That's an interesting title for a song by an Irish band in London, Transmetropolitan. Sounds kind of exciting, urban. The slow-paced opening bars of the song feature a gently strung banjo, a somewhat languid accordion. It's the sort of maudlin nostalgia that we might associate with very traditional forms of migrant song in London. But this somber tone is abruptly undercut when MacGowan's upbeat lyric in the rosy parts of England unexpectedly drops into the mix, the band suddenly accelerating tempo, and what the Pogues do in that moment, I think, is show a departure from traditional forms of migrant song in England. I'm going to play a quick excerpt of the band playing this live in 1984.
What's the
Again, in the interest of time, I'll stop there. So what I'm suggesting then is that in contrast to the sorts of migrant song that reject the urban host culture for an exalted rural homeland, what the Pogues do in Transmetropolitan is offer an exhilarant, upbeat eulogy for inner city London. Throughout the song, the band's sprightly pace and jaunty harmonic pattern provide the backcloth for MacGowan's words, which poeticize the mundane terrain of his urban locale, yielding unlikely exaltations of well-known English place names in an audibly Irish idiom. Although the singer would claim in an interview with me that his songs were tongue-in-cheek, his accolades to Brixton's lovely boulevards and Hammersmith's sightly shores nevertheless stress the importance of England in MacGowan's imagination. He's not singing about Galway Bay or the Mountains of Mourne, he's singing about Hammersmith and King's Cross and Brixton. Now, this emphasis on the host culture does not imply any wish to assimilate, however. MacGowan isn't clearly becoming English through these songs. Instead, in fact, throughout Transmetropolitan and the rest of the Pogues' work, MacGowan clearly expresses an openly Irish identity. One of the interesting examples of it in this song, and I ended the clip on it, is MacGowan's use of the abbreviation KMRAA, a contraction of Kiss My Royal Irish Arse, drawn from James Joyce's Ulysses. And what this abbreviation offers in the song is a kind of playful sign of defiance, insisting on MacGowan's difference from mainstream England. He might be singing about England and in England, but he's absolutely defiantly Irish whilst doing that. So this raises a really interesting point. We're being Irish in England. So there's a case of MacGowan staking space for an Irish identity in London, rather than simply returning to Ireland in a straightforward way. So what I think this song, and in fact lots of the Pogues' work, seeks to reconcile then, is an embrace of the English host culture alongside a display of Irish difference. These two things are happening at the same time. As the historian Ed Delaney has explained, the sort of focus on return to Ireland and a redemptive homecoming has loomed large in the imagination of the Irish in Britain, even after decades of living in Britain. But this impulse is not at all evident in Transmetropolitan. It offers a critique rather than a celebration of return to Ireland. So while MacGowan is not at ease in the host milieu, he's not comfortable in the host milieu. If you listen to songs like The Old Man Drag or NW3, MacGowan is not easily assimilated within an English environment, but at the same time he doesn't want to go back home either. As he sings in Transmetropolitan, we've been here for a long time and we'll be here till we die. Now such gestures suggest a wish to stake out space in the host culture, I think. And in this regard, I think MacGowan in the song seems to demonstrate the condition of what's called dwelling in displacement. That's a kind of sociological term to refer to the way that migrant groups maintain an attachment to the absent homeland whilst at the same time physically settling in the host culture. So it's quite a complex dynamic that's going on, but it's an attempt to settle in Britain and to integrate British life whilst maintaining a connection with Ireland in some way. No easy thing. In a sense, easier to retreat into one thing or the other, to become either English or Irish, but what MacGowan's doing is refusing that binary and insisting on being London Irish. It's a strange noise there. Now, the song's establishment of a London Irish outlook was extended in the Pogues' subsequent material. Is that?
That's not bad.
That's the best tune we heard all night.
Good, good. Yeah, I'll try that, yeah. I mean, one of the things about the musical styles that...
Oh, that's on.
Is that okay?
No.
No, that's not okay? Try that, okay. Is that okay? Yeah. One of the things about the musical styles that you've probably noticed already is that none of these musicians are engaging in what you might consider to be conventional Irish traditional music. And when asked about this, Kevin Rowland in Dexys said he couldn't, as much as he felt Irish and wanted to address Irish issues, it's off. Yeah. So it's sort of coming in. I mean, I could do it without the mic.
Yeah.
We can hear.
Unplugged. Acoustic. Authenticity. One of the things that Kevin said was that it wouldn't have made sense for him just to pursue an Irish musical style. He'd grown up amongst second-generation Jamaican and Italian kids listening to reggae and soul music. So when he came to perform music, it wouldn't have made sense for him just to focus on Irish music. He wanted to engage with Irish issues, but in a broader sort of style, broader template. He felt that was a more honest expression of who he was. And similarly with MacGowan, there's an attempt to engage with an Irish folk style, but to combine it with something that pertained to the present, to the here and now, to London in 1982, in the case of the Pogues. But one of the points I was making here before I go on to the final case study, I wanted to just make a few more points about MacGowan and the Pogues, is that one of the interesting things about the Pogues is that they're songs about London. And when people write books and make films about songs in London, they never mention the Pogues. The Pogues are seen as singing about Ireland. But actually there's a beautiful catalogue of songs about life in London in the 1980s from an Irish perspective. Look at the sheer volume of Pogues songs that reference the English capital in song titles and in song words. This catalogue of London songs offers an expressly Irish impression of the city, not least through MacGowan's habit of name-checking areas linked with Irish settlements, such as Hammersmith. But MacGowan's evocation of London isn't simply an Irish one, it's a multi-ethnic one. So there's something really interesting going on there, where MacGowan isn't just singing about the Irish and the English, he's singing about the Irish as part of a multi-ethnic context. And this is really overlooked in all of the sort of stuff that's written about Shane, which is obsessed with drinking and so on and so forth. That actually there's something quite sophisticated going on, particularly in the early Pogues' work. For example, the Pogues, in their songs, offered alliances with other ethnic groups. MacGowan, in his songs, through his persona, occupies immigrant social spaces such as Greek eateries or cosmopolitan cafes. In the very best Pogues song, and you won't hear academics say that very often, but in what is unquestionably the best song by the Pogues, which is the broad, majestic Shannon, the song is about being in London and coming to terms with not being an island anymore. But the song takes place in a Greek restaurant. So it's very cleverly set in a kind of multi-ethnic context already. Something very interesting about that. These kind of spaces, immigrant social spaces, restaurants, cosmopolitan cafes, serve as inter-ethnic contact zones, a space where different groups can come together. Now this notion of contact zones has a really interesting special resonance in musical life, because music, more than other artistic forms, is able to bring together a whole range of different genres and styles. So disparate styles and identities can come together, they can convene more readily, I think, in music, much more than in other artistic forms. Music is able to absorb difference in that way, I think, more than cinema or literature. So if you look at the multicultural mindset of the Pogues, in lyrics, it's underscored by the band's forays into ethnic sounds. So you've got Zydeco in London Girl. See, that's interesting. The song is London Girl, it's not a girl in East Clare or East Galway. He's singing about a London girl, it's an excited song, and there's Zydeco in it. They perform Spanish music in Epistle for Paddy Garcia, and famously in Fiesta, Arabic music in Turkish Song of the Damned, and even jazz in Metropolis. So what the Pogues offer in this context is what the theorist Josh Kuhn has called audiotopia, and this is just the only kind of slightly abstract sociological idea I'm going to reference before coming on to the Smiths. So Josh Kuhn talks about audiotopia as a musical space in which contradictions and conflicts don't cancel each other out, but rather coexist and live through each other. He says, audiotopias are identificatory contact zones in that they're both sonic and social spaces where different identities, cultures, and people historically kept and mapped separately are allowed to interact with each other. So music allowed the Pogues to bring together Irish and English experiences, which at the time was seen as separate. And it allowed them to express that hybrid dual identity of being London Irish by drawing on punk and folk at the same time. Now, these contradictions and conflicts that we're talking about here are often experienced within the lives of second-generation Irish people who feel conflicted about what they might be. And what I suggest in this conclusion on the Pogues, before I turn to the Smiths, is that what they reconciled was the sort of contemporary pop cultural and historical folk cultural strands of second-generation life. In other words, the pop music of contemporary urban English youth in the early 80s, with the music that their parents were listening to. In other words, MacGowan was into the Sex Pistols and the Clash, but was also into the Clancy Brothers and the Dubliners, and somehow wanted to find a way of reconciling these two worlds which were absolutely seen as separate. And he did it successfully. No mean achievement. Now, so to conclude that section then, what I'm suggesting is that the Pogues offer a kind of Irish and England identity, presenting themselves as explicitly London Irish, and the first band really to do that. Now, this idea of a hyphenated Irish English, which might be controversial, was explored differently by other second-generation Irish musicians, not least Morrissey and Johnny Marr of The Smiths. There's a quote here which might be a little bit small, but I'll read it out. A quote from Morrissey, first of all, born Stephen Morrissey in Manchester in 1959, both his parents from Crumlin in Dublin. Morrissey was asked, like many people are, well, what are you? Are you Irish or are you English? You have to make a decision. And Morrissey said, I had the best of both places, Dublin and Manchester, and the best of both countries, Ireland and England. I'm one of us on both sides. Which is a nice gesture, but you know, when England come to play Ireland, now that Roy Keane and Neil are managing the football team, will have a decent football team again. When they come to play each other at Wembley, you know, there are certain occasions in which you need to take sides. But I'm told, according to Morris's autobiography, he travels on an Irish passport. And he refers to his early upbringing, he describes himself, he uses the term "we Irish Catholics" when talking about himself in Manchester in the 50s and 60s. But also feels duality, hybridity. Johnny Marr, the guitar player in the Smiths, when asked the same question, said, I don't consider myself to be either Irish or English.